So I'm going to get started, and since we're recording, anyone who joins late will have the opportunity to go back. I'd like to welcome everyone today for taking time to visit with WAFA. And I wanted to just share a little bit about us so that for those who may not be familiar with us, we are the Wharton Alumni Founders and Funders Association. We basically say we have three types of Fs: founders, funders, and friends. And we are looking to help women become successful entrepreneurs, funders, as well as those that are producing products and services for the benefit of women. So we're not limited to just female participation. We're open to everyone. What we had noticed was that 50% of Penn student body is now female, but only 13% of the funders of Penn are women. And of that, only 6% of the venture dollars go to women. So we're trying to get some more equality and equity here. We do it three primary ways. One is to amplify, and we do that by sharing our message. We have a great newsletter that Pam Harris, our VP of Communications, puts out every Tuesday. And we try to highlight founders, funders, different educational programs, opening for pitches, et cetera. We also try to connect by building a very strong community. We have a Slack channel that we encourage everyone to participate. And lastly, we hope to inspire, which is bringing great programming, which is why we have Jory here with us today, so that we can help everyone be more successful by sharing what has worked, what hasn't worked, and where to find resources. So one of the things that we do think that is unique if you visit our website is we have a founder shop so that we actually promote the products and services of our members. So normally we would do a traditional welcome and a little profile of the individual, but since we're going to be doing a fireside chat over the next hour, hour and a half, you're going to get to know a whole lot about Jory, his travel, his journey. So I'm going to not do it twice so that we don't end up being redundant. And lastly, if you would please mute your microphones, I would really appreciate it. I hate to do it on a mass level because then when we do open it up for conversations, it gets tricky. You have to unmute and mute. So we'll just trust everyone's judgment. We're going to ask that you put your questions in the chat and I will monitor them. In the first hour, we're really going to try and get Jory to share his journey. He has some tremendous insights that I know will be very helpful for you. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A where you can ask very specific questions if we didn't cover them. So without further ado, Jory, welcome. Today I'd like to bust some myths. You and I have had a great opportunity to spend a lot of time speaking together. I'm going to share with all of you, I was so impressed with Jory. We met back in May. We kept on a conversation. He agreed to be a speaker. And I am now going to work for Andy Young because I was so impressed with Jory. I was like, I'm even willing to move to Manhattan for him, something I've avoided for decades. So I hope that you find this morning as enjoyable. Some of the myths that we are all under the impression of is that everyone's journey is exactly the same. So as Jory shares his journey, please keep in mind some things are going to fit perfectly for you and some are going to, what? That doesn't make any sense. Second, that entrepreneurs are born. You either are or you aren't. That there's a strong link between the purpose of a company and some kind of personal interest to the founder. That it is a straightforward, smooth path that once you get on it, boy, everything is easy street. That success is the best teacher. And that investors and funders only prefer those who have successful track records. And I think you're going to see today that that is just not true. So Jory, with that, were you born an entrepreneur? How did you decide to become one?
That's a good question. I'd probably start by saying that most entrepreneurs, especially if you're younger, get into it accidentally. Normally, it just kind of comes from a sense of not feeling like the way the path for you is as fitting as what you see around you. If I look at my family, I guess I would say my brother is an entrepreneur and I'm an entrepreneur. My father is an entrepreneur and my mother and my sister are not at all. They're they're very structural, but all very smart. In fact, they're definitely smarter than we are. There's no question. My brother's path started at a company where he worked for years. Mine started in grad school and then into some consulting. But I think I'd say the common theme I find in a lot of entrepreneurs is this like desire for impact and grit tends to overlap with like an enduring like need to press that concept on the world in a way that you're willing to take a lot of existential risk. So I think as the years have gone on, the themes that I've noticed the most as I've also started to become an investor is how's it going? Is the amount of grit.
Good morning.
That,
Mauricio, nice to see you.
Ray, could you
Sorry,
please
I'm on a
mute?
webinar.
Yes, Ray, could you please mute?
Sorry.
so one of the common overlapping themes that I tend to see is most founders' journeys started with something they loved or they believed needed to be a certain way in the world, but in reality, usually dovetail through a lot of pivoting into a space where they feel they have the most impact. And so what you love and what is most impactful don't necessarily align perfectly. We always talk about this concept of marrying the circles when we talk about entrepreneurship. There's the things that you're good at, there's the thing that the world needs, and there's the things that you like to do. And somewhere in that like middle is what I think all entrepreneurs aim at when they start. It just tends to not always sit in that middle of those circles, and you kind of hover around them, right? And you do your best to stay as close to that middle as you can. And I think that tends to be one of the heavy driving factors that I find quite a bit in early stage journeys, including my own. My journey started in graduate school. The cameras above intersections that were replacing loops under the grounds in order to be more efficient I was working on that technology in graduate school and realized that it seemed insane that the intersections were at the mercy of the highway system, but had way better information. And so I saw this opportunity and this thesis that most information out of the environment is not great. And so finding better ways to get information out of the environment rather than just data was something that I felt was like really valuable. And from a technology perspective, it's the most impactful because technology oftentimes is more about empowering people and empowering like change than it is at like turning dials. I think of that as more like engineering, like physically flipping a switch and changing a light bulb, and all those types of things are more engineering focused. So when I started my journey, I had just finished grad school and it was 2008. So every one of my friends was going into grad school because the world was collapsing. And so most people found themselves going and getting another degree because they didn't know what else to do. And I was coming out of grad school and I was like, well, I already make no money. It seems like a great opportunity to go and try to do something on my own before I have any concept of what it's like to have a real paycheck. So my journey started pretty early and manifested in some of the most interesting ways. I spent a good amount of time in South America, just following a path of an idea that I had. And I think I ended up in Norway for almost a year before finding my way back to the US. And in that journey, I think what I realized was that technology was changing at such a rapid pace that there was a lot of disruption opportunity, but that the world, where problems come from and where you can solve those problems, where you can have that impact, you kind of have to wait for the world to catch up. And so the length of the journey kind of built through a lot of ideation and a lot of development, a lot of trying to figure out how to solve larger problems without creating even larger problems. A good example, anecdotally, like Andium as a company, what we do is we monitor industrial environments, trying to bring them data to reduce their impact on climate change. So we work with a lot of large oil and gas operators, but we also work with mining companies and other segments trying to help them abate or mitigate methane and other harmful gases from being released into the atmosphere. It's a major problem, but that problem also tends to be profitable. So finding that impact was useful, not just for Andium, but also for our customers, because that's something they can sell if they do it more appropriately. But that journey wasn't how we started. We started because we were looking for a way to apply some cool technology to an antiquated space, because we felt such a high risk venture, finding a low risk environment in a way. Commodities market seemed like a good place to start. I actually think the more interesting parts of the journey came when this idea started to gain traction through finding good people, but we started to realize we needed money. That tends to be the first impasse for a lot of startups, is you have to either raise capital or create revenue. And for anyone starting the journey, I would highly recommend creating revenue. It's a much better approach. It's not as easy, but if you can do it, you can avoid a lot of painful lessons, a lot of time spent. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of like ecosystems for startups. So there wasn't like accelerators. There wasn't a lot of financing. Was basically all out in California. New York was like a very new space to fundraising when we were raising capital. And we actually started out in California and found our way into New York eventually. But through the journey, I think the more interesting pieces were where your impact can be and the things you can do. You kind of find your way towards the ones that have the most impact on others. So an example that I think about a lot is, while we were building the technology and trying to find our space as a side hustle, just for fun, we built an app that allowed phones to connect with each other through wireless networks without cellular, so we could contact each other at events. And this was before cell coverage was good enough at Lollapalooza and some of these other festivals that we like to go to. So for fun, while we were burning through the midnight oil, we invented an app that ended up getting downloaded in like 108 countries. And then venture showed up, and we were like, why is venture so easy to find in this place and so much harder in these areas? We thought it would be more interesting. We didn't feel like the impact we could have with that technology matched up. So we used the underlying technology, but we actually open source all the code. I think it ended up getting used a lot in China during a lot of the protests, but it was a really fun journey. We launched it at Tech Disrupt. It was a whole ecosystem. But that's like an example of something where the idea is very cool, but you really have to decide what impact you're really looking to have and how big of an opportunity that impact can be, rather than just following the thing that is like the shiny object. So we ran into that in a lot of the early days as well. Eventually, when I started raising capital, you realize that there's a consistency with storytelling that falls into the capital raising side. But I think most early stage investors, they're betting on founder, not just on the story. And so it's, as you can put together the impact you're going to have and line that up with what it is you're raising to go do, it's a combination of the two. Because if you already have your revenue, of course you can just raise from a financial perspective, but that tends not to be true in most cases. More often than not, if you're raising capital, it's because you're losing money, not because you're making a lot of money. And I got to see that journey firsthand as we were losing money to go build our market. My brother was profitable in the very beginning with his venture. So he actually beat me to exit. So when he exited, we started looking at investing in others. And we had this nice counterplay where, going back to your question, I think my brother is a founder because he believes that people can have very large impacts. So he builds people organizations, and he's very gung-ho on there's a right culture that you can build in order to have that level of impact. So finding the right people and building people. I happen to believe that technology helps change the world by empowering people. So similarly, you build people, but it's a little bit different because you also have to build this pesky technology thing that needs to exist and in a way sell itself in order to have the impact you're looking to have in the market. So that's kind of like a little bit of the background on the early journey. I'd say that the most interesting piece before some of the back and forth lawyers, I'd end by saying we ran out of money twice. We've raised north of $40 million at this point. And the most interesting thing I've learned is that I had a lot more fun in the phases where we were running out of money than I had when we had a lot of money. And that's just because when you're running out of money, you're just kind of really focused on the things you're good at and how do you like get these things across the line. I actually don't think we knew we were out of money the first time we ran out. I think we noticed it after we closed on new capital. It was our first large fundraise. We did it in like 2 weeks. It was like the greatest 2 weeks. We raised like our first $1 million. And then we went and looked at the accounts and realized we had been overdrawn for like 30 days. So we were really at the end, we just didn't know it, which was super terrible because raising in 2 weeks sets you up terribly for your next fundraise. You think it's super easy. That's when it took us like 9 months to go close. So that's kind of a little bit of background on the early stage journey.
So I want to thank you for proving a couple of points for me. First of all, that it's not the same for everyone, even just between you and your brother growing up in the same family, approach very differently. Different things attracted you in the first place. Different things turn you on or get you excited about it. I know your brother was up to 600 employees. Your preference is small, more intimate companies. So probably, except for the fact that your brother is almost tremendously different between the two of you. So one of the things that I get frustrated about as a people person is that sometimes people think, oh, well, if it worked for Jory, I'll just do it the same exact way. And they get into trouble and they don't know how they got there because they thought they did everything they saw. So thank you for proving the first point that everybody's on a different journey. And for also breaking the myth or busting the myth that it is an easy, smooth journey, because it's not. You know, you've had where you've gained money, lost money, and so we're going to be delving into that in a lot more detail, and what worked and what didn't work. So you talked about the company that started with the intersections, and how did you get from there to Andium, and that Andium wasn't even focused on methane until after your journey was quite into the details, had been around for a couple of years, was already focused on one particular path, and then you correctly used pivot, which we'll get into as well. How did all those steps lead you to where you are now?
Yeah, I like the word pivot. I feel like that if I ever wrote a book, it would just be called Pivot, because I think a lot of the mission statement that companies have, or the vision that a founder has, it tends to not change as that much. It tends to just pivot, because how you can go about implementing the vision you have in your head, I mean, again, you can wildly change what you're working on, but a lot of it stems from the same impact you think you can have. And so pivot is a really good way of thinking about the journey, because I think from the very beginning, the first product, when we were working early in the traffic days, it was about pivoting the product to meet customers' expectations, or what we were trying to solving a specific problem. And so in the early days, the story went, I built a device that initially could track assets, because tracking the assets is actually far more important, just like in intersections, than it was watching the driver. There's a lot of red ocean of companies working on following the driver, but a lot of the cost center and loss values and the trailer. So I had this idea that you could create a tracking device that didn't need endless energy, like an endless battery, and need to be plugged into power, because we could mine the energy off of the motion of the trailer. It's called piezoelectric. And I've done all this research to demonstrate it, and started working on the university side to build it out, only to find that since like the 80s, when all that research had come out, they had gotten so much better at stabilization on suspension systems that the amount of energy that could be generated off of piezo looked nothing like the original research. So practical implementation, we were like, okay, it's not going to work to generate it off of the motion of the vehicle. You know what? Let's do it off the sun. And so we put out a solar panel, and we kind of made like a very flexible solar material that could work on top of the tracking device. And then Minnesota winters, because that's where I grew up, destroyed it, right? Because these things wouldn't move for a while, build up with snow, and then the thing would die, and then bring it back online. You'd be like, how did it leave wherever it was supposed to leave without the details you were looking for, and then in the cold and the batteries? So we quickly realized the difficulty in stabilizing the technology. The third piece was realizing that once we could get power to it with a battery and so on, it's that you need to figure out where they actually need the information. In other words, did they really need to be able to track the device all the time if it was going to operate that way. And so as we started pivoting, what we realized was the implementation of tracking technology turned out not really the problem they were trying to solve. It turns out that what they were really trying to solve was logistics from the standpoint of where things are supposed to be versus with expectation of where they are, which is a completely different problem. And so as we pivoted to meet our customers' expectations, we realized that if we did this long enough, we would probably just run out of time and cadence and never actually solve anything. So eventually I found myself in South America implementing a technology that could track. So ships are built like Legos. They basically build a component in like a facility, then they take that component and they send it up to pasture, and it like sits in like a container with like a label on it, and it's like massive field the size of like 20 soccer stadiums. And then when they go to build the next component, they're like, we need 3 yellow pieces and 6 red pieces, so they have to call them all back. And so we had built this like tracking technology, and we were like, they needed to know where they are at the right time, because otherwise you can't get this logistics problem solved. So we ended up trying to build very, very low cost, almost like RFID, but more designed to be like power friendly and almost like Bluetooth, which is a really fun space. And while I was down there doing it, I happened to have gone to a soccer game with some friends, and Matt happened to be sitting next to us, our now chairman, who was a Norwegian guy who was in the area, and he told us that the solution to these problems with Bluetooth, if anyone's ever tried to pair their phone, got much better all of a sudden because of a technology called Bluetooth Low Energy. And it really was this concept of making a Bluetooth chip into a full computer. So I ended up flying out to Norway because I was like, there's got to be a more effective way to build this logistics solution. And when we were out there, I saw this. If anyone is, I'm sure many of you, at a desktop tower, now all of that's etched into silicon. So it's just like this tiny little chip. And I remember telling the guys, like, you've built the world's smallest computer. This is a perfect conduit to do these things we're trying to do. And they're like, no, it's just a Bluetooth chip. We're like, no, like this is potentially game changing. And they were like, yeah, it's very cheap. Like, no, like they're like, pairing will be better. And I was like, you don't understand. You're sitting on something much bigger. So we ended up using that as a pivot to see if we could build microchips in general on a network that could solve these larger logistics challenges. And it turns out that commodity markets in general have the same problem. It's literally the same thing we were running into with cameras, trying to solve asset level information. And so we started using these tiny little chips. And I think we raised our first check when I built the world's dumbest, oldest application in history. We built Whack-A-Mole. It was a bunch of blinking LEDs where we could show that we could see where they were and map them, but also reprogram them through this network. And you could reset them as fast as you wanted, but it would propagate the application so quickly. And it was such a compelling blinky light app that we raised our first angel round against that. As we got into markets, what we realized quickly, though, is that logistics problems that you're solving, you have to have an outcome that they like, tend to just bring you new problems, right? How do they implement this? Is the cost of implementing the technology actually going to be a greater value than the cost to the labor and management of the technology that's going to go theoretically solve this logistics problem that they're talking about? And so where we ended up pivoting that brought us to where we are today is in realizing that the real value of the operating system, the real value of this thing we were building on these little chips, was that we could solve many problems for our customer and follow them down the rabbit hole. The hard part is that just because it solves one of their problems doesn't mean that the value that it brings was going to be enough to justify this device they wanted to buy. So it's a lot of storytelling in the early days as we brought on customers. And it just so happens that the problems in industrial spaces are common. And therefore, as we built up more and more of these little logistic devices that could bring in and pull data out of the environment to help the operators more effectively manage assets, that the problems moved from how do I know what's going on logistically to how do I manage my people to how do I manage these assets and this new world we're moving into in ESG. And so like, it's kind of a pivot all the way along, but But again, it's this same idea of using technology as an empowerment mechanism by putting out asset level information and trying to help gather that information to like move the needle forward. The same way the plow to the tractor, right? Still the guy in the back of it, right? Just pushing it along, trying to solve bigger and bigger problems.
So I think you've raised a couple of key issues. One is that it's all about the problem that you're trying to solve. I know that seems to be the number one reason why a lot of startups fail is the founder is interested in solving their problem and then looking to sell it, as opposed to seeing a problem that's there and then building the solution to the customer's problem. So I think that's a big one. I think also the listening, I know that that's very important to you, to listen more than speak, is to hear what's going on around you. You know, at the soccer game, the person sitting next to you, engaging in conversation, checking it out, and being open-minded to be able to migrate from where you thought you were going to be to where you end up being in each of the steps. That the pivot isn't because you're just thinking, oh, what can I do differently? But listening to what consumers are telling you, listening to what the problems are, finding out, oh, you're close, but not quite. So how do you get even closer? So it is the right answer. So could you share a little bit more about that? Because I think that's where a lot of founders get caught up is, you know, I'm in this business and what you're looking for, that's not what I'm selling. Yes, that's what you're buying, but I don't know what to do about that or how to get there.
Yeah, I'd say the anecdotal piece that I would, when I work with founders in general, that I try to highlight is there's a big difference between productization or commercialization and problem solving. They sound the same, but they're not the same. And it's not because your solution is designed to solve a problem. It's actually because the space that you're moving into is usually a larger ecosystem than the thing that you think you're solving. And so it's not just listening. It's actually sometimes just being in the right place at the right time, right? And taking enough shots with enough cadence and enough determination to stick it out while you work through the bigger challenge. Grit is like this very common theme in early stage that's really, really important. And it's not stubbornness, right? I think it's more this idea of grit of working through the problem and trying to expand it and build a product eventually, but build towards that. I think in early stage, it's a lot of pivot, whereas product market fit, which is more once you're a bit farther along, that's more productization and how do you get from the thing that you're solving and to have increase its impact, right? Which is all about, it turns out it's all about scaling people. Far less to do with the technology than it has to do with the people on the scaling side. But in the early days, I think it's, you get some good people on board, right? You do your best to find people that are like-minded. Like-minded is usually about your common values. And so early days for us, it was finding people who also wanted to have that level of disruption, but also had that grit. And again, commonly a mistake as time goes on is to hold on to people so hard in order to hold on to that culture, not realizing that they're kind of independent things and they kind of both evolve in their own way, right? People's values change or what they're focused on changes, but the company's culture also changes. And so as you work through a lot of the grit and the early problem solving that you're doing, you're not really building towards your initial product in the beginning. You're pivoting to help educate and help build out an ecosystem or a space in which there's a lot of shots to take with your customers to get that across the line. I'd say if you feel like you have product market fit that early on, you probably waited too long to take it to market. Like I said, is that catch-up piece that happens. We ran into that when we first got into energy. So we were using these technology and logistics. We were using it in buildings to help try to make the building management system more effective. It turns out the smart building management systems only exist at the innovation centers of your Siemens. It's the only place they actually exist. And that's just because of the way that logistics of building and technology itself interact. It's just really a laggard space in that way. When we went into oil and gas, we actually went in because a friend was saying, hey, listen, the logistics we were solving to build ships is the same problem they're having out in these, like, the middle of nowhere, a communication of devices. The themes were the same. And actually, we never knew what an oil and gas field looked like when we went into it. So talking about that transition, nobody that we worked with knew anything about the space. The first time we went out to northern Texas, also it was known as Canadian Texas, which is such a weird name, like the north of Texas, Canadian Texas. Went out there, we saw the most amazing oil site where it was pulling out of the ground and they were trying to like run these tanks. And we didn't know that this was like the worst performing site that they had. They just like, go over here, see if you can solve a problem over here. We'll give you a shot to see if you can do something. But for us, this was like brand new space. So spending a lot of time there, we were able to understand that the problem they were trying to do with whether you could pull information out of the environment to solve just their problem. There's a whole group of people, it's a whole ecosystem that needs to get solved in order just to come up with a product that is tenable to use in those types of environments. And so going back to the very early part of this conversation, stupidity is how we ended up in our market. We just didn't know we were in like the worst performing, very unlikely to buy anything part of the ecosystem that we ended up building and really building our impact. It was off of those assets that, for example, even today, the largest methane releases are these super emitter events that are generally not happening at like brand new drilled wells. That's just not how that works. It's usually at these like antiquated sites that no one is keeping an eye on, and they don't even know the scope of the problem that they're dealing with because they're debating whether to like stop using the location at all. So it's a very interesting transition into it. But I'd say that back to your point, you generally just have to grit it out long enough and really feel like the idea is correct, and then work it through with a lot of people in order to come up with the product opportunity and the ability to take enough shots to try and get that over the line. What you're selling investors, what you're selling customers, and what you're selling your team, you're trying to make that cohesive, right? That's that vision that a lot of founders really should have in their head. It's not necessarily about like that thing that you're really passionate about alone. You have to marry those pieces together. And that's where that grit shows up. And you tend to see that in a lot of early stage founders that have found success is that idea. It wasn't that they had this one idea that was going to be disruptive. Is this kind of this path between all these stakeholders, not to build a product, but to get enough shots to try and see if they could collaboratively get all these people on the same page. That tends to create the outcome of the opportunities that they're willing to pay for. And as a product of that, you can build a product.
So that raises a whole area, Jory, of you talk about, stupidity, going out, not knowing necessarily what you're looking at. When people are looking to build those teams, and you touched on it a little bit, how do you go into an area that you're not experienced on, you don't have the background, you know what your strengths are, and now you're looking for people to build out your team. Do you pick people who have the same strengths, complementary strengths? How do you find that best success? Because I think you have an approach that's a little bit different than some might expect.
Okay, so there's two pieces to this. That's a good topic. There's the early stage and the later stage in a lot of different ways. And one of them is how you, like founders, how they think about growth in the early stage versus the reality of how they need to build in the later stage. A lot of good founders in the early stage, that's what they're really good at. And so what ends up happening is they end up working their way down. The best ones end up working their way down their organization because of the change that occurs. Examples of that are like Dyson, right? Like Sir Dyson, I don't think he's been the CEO forever. And technically Jobs wasn't the CEO very quickly either, right? It's a matter of like leaning into the things you're really good at in the early stage. So you tend to find people that are like-minded, that are trying to solve the same problem, that believe in impact the way you believe in impact, that the thing you're good at, whether it's technology or people or even products, you want to find people like you. And the reason is because the only thing that a startup has going for it in the early stage is the differentiated value of that team, right? And the ability to quickly build and pivot. That's it. Like everything else is working against you. You have no money, you have no brands, you have no products, you have no customers, like everything else is against you. But it turns out that leaning into your strengths has a lot of benefit in the early stage. And so a lot of the successes we see as we've invested, even alongside, let alone our own, my brother and I, often comes back to that. It's that grit, that determination, and finding like-minded people that are able to take that differentiated value and expand upon it. What happens though is as you get closer to product, and I don't even mean product market fit necessarily, but as you get closer to product, that switches. It has to like invert, because as you build the people around you to support that differentiated value, you need everything you're terrible at. And whenever I'm mentoring early stage founders, I always say, listen, you're gonna have to be every role in the beginning, right? You're gonna wanna spend as much time on the things you're really good at, and you should bring in people that are good at the things you're good at. Not because those other things don't need to get done, but because as you bring in people who are better than you at the things that you're not good at, you kind of want to be a little bit dirty, right? You want to be a little bit like dangerous, right? Like you can build a basic financial model and you're the lawyer. But in reality, eventually, it wasn't very hard for us. For example, early stage, we brought on an intern who we needed for finance in the early days. And 3 questions in, we were way in over our head. We're asking him questions and he was asking us questions in return to expand upon what we had asked him about the model, and quickly realized like, oh, we don't know what we're talking about. We're really bad at this. That was a phase where we started to realize that to scale, that first piece of scaling, you want people that are good at the things you're not good at, but you need to understand them well enough that you can continue to make decisions and pour your time into the things you're good at. And so that really helps define that early stage team that you build around you. And a lot of people, the challenge they have in finding co-founders, which is a common theme, is they're looking for somebody that's their weakness. They're saying, no, like I had this great idea. I need somebody to build the tech. That's a very, very common one we see today. And our response is like, no, like if your differentiation is technology, your core team needs to be technology. If your core differentiator is the value you can provide, not through technology, but through hard work and grit, find people like that technology can come with time. You will build that out. I'm sure you will use Airtable and all sorts of tools to kind of figure it out just enough to get you to MVP. But the reality is that your differentiated value is the hard work you're putting in on the things you're very good at. And that leading edge is the thing that's going to carry you. So that's a big bifurcated layer of growth in the early stage that people need to think about, or founders tend to not realize, is that you actually just should lean into your strengths in the early stage. That most people make that mistake. They try to find a co-founder that's the opposite to round out their weaknesses. And we tend to find that those like putter around a lot, never tend to find the proper impact necessary to build and create enough shots to layer the cake. It's not impossible, it's just like way harder.
Excellent. So if you were mentoring yourself, your younger self, what, you had mentioned, it's a roller coaster. What wisdom would you give your younger self, or what do you give to the folks that you currently mentor?
Oh my God. This is so hard every founder will tell you they could rebuild their company in 18 months. And it doesn't matter if they're 18 months in or 10 years in. And that's because the things of course, doing those again, the expertise you have, the network you have, all these things like that kind of build up. My younger self, I would have told him to pivot way faster. Like spent way too much time on these like rabbit holes forever and ever. Like, what were you doing? When I think about others, I find that they really just need to get things done. So my favorite quote, which is anecdotal from a movie, is that a lot of them worry about what's going to happen because of the decisions they make. It creates a lot of paralysis in the early stage founders, and in myself as an early stage founder too. You just worry a lot, and because you're worrying a lot, you tend to like miss out on some of the opportunities that could be really good for the business. And I would just like, worrying doesn't get you anywhere. It's definitely something to do. It's like a rocking chair. give you something to do, but it's not going to get you anywhere. And I would encourage myself to just make more decisions faster and pivot quicker and worry less, right? And there's endless reasons to worry. And you know what, this is the other funny part. As we've grown as a company, I don't think anything got easier. I expected like, oh, we'll just do this and then everything is going to get easier. We'll just raise capital and everything will get easier. It doesn't. It just gets different. Right? It just changes. It's not any easier. And so I would also highlight to them that don't expect it to get any easier. It just gets different. And so the advice I would give myself on top of that is to think of a startup like a roller coaster. your bottom is always the same. Bad days are bad days. There's no way, like running out of money at any stage sucks. Losing core members right at deadlines, we've had that happen, just the worst things that can happen. And so we used to memorialize the bad days in the same way. And that way we could remember the consistency of those bad days to normalize it for us. The ups always change. And so the advice I would say is come up with something that every time you have a very, very bad day, and you'll know, you do something that can remind you how terrible it is and why you never want it to happen again. And unfortunately, the first time this happened to me and my team, we happened to be at like a dive bar. And I came up with the brilliantly terrible idea to take a shot of room temperature rail vodka. Like that was, don't know why that was the thing. And it was terrible. And now every time we have an absolutely awful day, that's what we go do. Of course, we chase it with something better, but we still do it. But the good days are always different. And so by benchmarking like a really good day, it's always going to be different. And that allows you to do a little bit of dreaming and looking forward to that and takes away some of that worry. So those would be the piece of advice I would have. It's like, I think our early stage good day was covering up the prices on the menu at a restaurant. That was an awesome day. We didn't think about what things were going to cost and how terrible tomorrow might be. Later on, I think my team, I took them for a week in Napa. So the ups change, but the downs are still the rail room temperature vodka shot.
So having had some failures, some rock bottom days, as well as some peaks of success. I know that you're in the final stages of closing your next round. You and your brother are also investors. Do you prefer to invest in founders who've only had successes, big or small, or do you like some that have had some failures? So which, in essence, is success or failure the better teacher?
Oh, well, most of the investments we've made are in first-time founders. And so I'd say that we don't think it matters what you've been through before. Obviously, there's huge advantages because if you can rebuild a company in 18 months from any point, or you feel that way, then betting on a founder that's been there before, even in failure, those early pieces, those learned lessons, they're going to be carried through. When we got into investing, we were mentoring and we started realizing there were some really good founders, and we just started using our own money. We were like, oh, are you guys raising? And so it ended up just happening in the very beginning. As time went on, a lot of people that had invested in us were like, who are you investing in? And so we kind of started syndicating, gave us this opportunity to invest in things when we ran out of money. Because at some point, like, you can only deploy so much capital into startups and still handle all the things that you want to do yourself, let alone the time. I'd say the common themes that we see in a lot of these founders, though, is this like drive towards expertise in their strength and this determination to keep following it through. A lot of them we've mentored over time and watched them raise even, and we didn't participate because we didn't think it made sense. And then as time went on, watch them pivot and start to find their way. And as you do, you can kind of see the same themes. It's that grittiness, that desire to work through pain and suffering, because pain and suffering is just, it's like beyond grit. It's just part of the course. You got to be able to handle that type of stress. I'd almost say that the difference between those guys that have done before, or that early stage and that later stage, is in existential risk. So when I started my business, I had no idea what I would do if it didn't work. Maybe that was the luck, right? I was too stupid to know, like, what the hell are you doing? My brother started his because he was consulting for a company that had an idea. And then, so he was like paid on day one. He had a good job at the time. And so he wasn't coming in from existential risk. I think his first interaction with existential risk came at the point of when money got tight, right? Or when they were like running low on money. Those you feel other people's risk when that happens. When you start out with existential risk, you don't think about that too much. It just is. It's just always kind of there. And so those that kind of work through it, I find a lot of the losses, a lot of the mess ups and all those, they just kind of demonstrate the repeatability of the ability to handle that type of risk, but also to like persevere. And so for sure, failure is a better teacher, right? There's no question. I don't think anyone learns a lesson quite as well when they win as when they lose. No one looks back at why they won. Like, I mean, maybe they do, but like less often, right? And you definitely remember your losses a lot more. I can definitely count those. I can't tell you how many people passed up on investing in us in the early days. And in my head, I'm like, I'm gonna buy them a bottle of wine when we crush it. I have no idea what that list is, but I was confident like they're all wrong, like that like determination. But the successes help you carve in. They actually make you more rigid because those successes help you think, oh, I can repeat this. And so failure is definitely a better teacher, but successes help navigate your path. And so you kind of need a little both.
Okay, so the name, how would you define existential risk? You know, you've used it a couple of times. How would somebody differentiate that from other types of risk?
Yeah, I think existential risk is that idea that you don't know what you would do. There's no plan if it doesn't work, right? And whatever it is. I think when a lot of people, when they hit the pandemic, a lot of companies started running low or out of money, right? And if you weren't far enough along to have investors, excuse me, as a founder that could back you, that could support you during those times, or let alone the infrastructure and the team and all the other things necessary. I think a lot of people got to feel existential risk the first time if they were early stage founders, because for the first time, there was no safety net, not until the government kind of stepped in. And so during those early times, there was a lot of feeling of that true feeling of what you would define as existential risk, that there's no floor here. Like if we go out, we go out. And if we're out, like, I don't know what I would do. Maybe I'd start another venture. Like, I don't know. 2008 was helpful because that falling out gave me that immediate understanding of like, well, there's no job waiting for me. there's nowhere to turn. I'd have to go home. Like, where else am I going to go? So I think that's when I think of when I think of existential risk. Anybody who manages a budget knows that budget theoretically is going to be there, right? That's that feeling of safety, whether it's a job, right, and getting your paycheck or any of those things. That while they can disappear, the repeatability of a paycheck is removing of an existential risk. So not knowing you could lose your job can feel existential, but you can just get another one, or you feel you could. And if you don't feel you could get another, you're going to feel existential risk. That's the feeling you're going to have. And so I'd say that's a good way of helping define the difference.
Are there steps that people can do to make existential risk more tolerable?
Yeah, never change your quality of life until you're confident you're not going to go back. So I remember I was still living on a graduate stipend when I was doing consulting work, and the consulting paycheck was so outlandish compared to what I was getting as a research assistant that I didn't know what to do with it. So I just like left it in the account. I like literally didn't, I didn't do anything about it. I just kind of like left it there. And so I never changed living in like a terrible, well, honestly, I did the first time I knew how where I was living versus like quality of life versus what like normal spend looked like was when my father showed up with the family Suburban, because I was living in a really shady part of town to make it work, and I hadn't told him, and my brother told on me because I asked him for a small loan. And he showed up and he's like, "We are going home. Like, risk this feeling of you putting your life at danger to live in this like absolutely shut out apartment." It's the dumbest idea, and that's you just being an idiot. But eventually you get to a point where the support infrastructure that you have is high enough that you raise your quality of life to match it. You should always try to keep it below, right? It doesn't matter how much below, but that safety margin, that's really important because it's very difficult emotionally to go backwards, right? Like if you don't know how nice it can be, like there's no difference to you, right? That would be a huge, I would say, is like if somebody's leaving a really cushy job, just be prepared for that like floor fallout and really pull back and expect that to be the new norm. Hard days are coming one way or another. Even when things are amazing, there's always another day.
So do you believe that founders can be built, that they can be, that that they can be nurtured? Have you come across people who kind of want it, but are a little unsure? They're not sure if they're willing to take on the full existential risk, but they're dipping their toe.
Okay, here's a good way to think about this. I think there's two types of companies. There's growth companies, and then there's leisure companies. And don't quote me on the language and the specific use of words here, but the concept difference to me is that a leisure company is trying to create value for its team, and the team is trying to maximize itself. So like any business that's a lifestyle business would be a good example. Growth companies, you're trying to increase in your size at an exponential rate or as fast as you can. Those are the companies that take venture capital, right? Those are the companies that like take jet fuel, right? And if you're just trying to make a car go down the street, you really have no need to go buy jet fuel. Like that's a terrible use of time and money and so on. Building a growth company as a founder requires a certain like determination, a certain set of values and natural, guess is the wrong word, but natural tendencies of that, characteristics. Building a leisure or a lifestyle business does not. And in a lifestyle business, I'd actually argue you need a different set of skills. And those I think are much more teachable. You could go to business school and learn all the lessons learned of everyone else, and then implement a process that's consistent. That works. But in growth, it doesn't, because naturally to make those work, you need a disruptive nature, which means you need these like core components to yourself. So if you have like those core things, then yeah, of course, all of the founders really always building, right? Building new skills, building new things. But I don't think you can build a lot of those initial values. At least the data tends to suggest you can't. Doesn't mean it's not done. It just means it's not the norm or the average. And so I think you can nurture them, but finding a way to lean into their strengths, like those things, and having that grittiness to go along with it, I think those are like essential requirements of building a scaling company, at least exponential scale.
So as your new people person, I'm glad to hear that, because we would be looking for certain innate qualities that are there, but they can be nurtured to bring them out even more so. So they may be underdeveloped, or so a blend is still probably ideal. And
here's the thing. If you think of a company like a pyramid, I think the mistake a lot of people would make is they build a pyramid the way you think of a pyramid right now in your head. It's like really narrow at the top, right? It's like one dude and he sits on the top of the world and he's telling everyone what to do from a privileged position at the top. I actually think of a growth company as inverted. It's an upside down pyramid, right? It tends to line up better with all of the common themes too, like shit rolls downhill. Like that fact that this one guy at the bottom is kind of just trying to hold everything and figure out like how to lead the company to stabilize, right? Growth is kind of going up though, right? And so naturally, people that you bring in, they need different skills, because you need stability blocks and you need people that are going to expand out the space and keep growing it. But I think the real value in building a team as you grow this way is that you don't really want more than one founder. I'm going to be honest. I would argue, most of my people would argue, one founder is too many, right? It's, so I think that that's kind of another important piece here, is that building companies isn't about building founders. Building companies is about building companies. Building founders is about building founders. And I think those are two independent things that happen to collide when you build scaling businesses.
So that raises, as I'm watching, what's going on in the chat about, having co-founders being similar rather than opposite. But also we have a question about, is it wise to build businesses with family members?
Okay, I have a great story, and it is a painful story. So those are always the best stories. So I hired my uncle at one point. We had just raised capital. We had a lot of like space to grow, and he had an expertise that we really needed. The challenge that you run into working with family members, and we can talk about later stage versus early stage, is that a business is more like a soccer team or a sports franchise than it is like a family. So naturally, there's promotion and demotion, there's expectation in others, but how people feel is irrelevant from the standpoint of like building a team. You need to make it rational. But in family, building's irrelevant. Rationality is how people feel. So working with family members, even in a reasonable outcome, is going to have a lot of emotional carry that often isn't worth the squeeze. Now, I'd say if somebody was asking me, would I work with friends versus would I work with family, I would probably have a slightly different answer. But I think working with a family member, especially as you're growing a business, is a terrible idea. It's awful. Like my brother and I are nothing alike. We know we would never work together from the standpoint. Like it's really difficult to do that. Early stage ideation, you can do that type of stuff together. It's just really hard to do really strong segmentation to make sure that the emotional pieces are well supported, because it's not run like a family. It's run like a sports franchise where you're trying to like set milestones against promotion and then you just do it again. So no one can look backwards and be like, yeah, but look how good I did. Like, yeah, congratulations, but you're still going, right? You still got to keep driving forward. So that ended poorly and that it wasn't working for me, but even when he left, the emotional pieces, because he wasn't pulling his weight within the company, or the company didn't have a need for him. It could have even have been that. Hard to know exactly. Creates a lot of risk that is far more real than like when you let go of an employee, even if they're your friend. I've let go of employees that were my friend, and I would definitely say that the consensus with other founders I've run into is there is no consensus on whether hiring friends are a good idea. And the best answer I have on that one is it depends if the friendship was built around the business. Then great idea. But a lot of people will subscribe to the reverse. They'll say, no, you bring your friends in and yeah, about 90% of your friends are it's not gonna work out and you guys are gonna hate each other probably. The averages are not on your side. But when it works, it crushes. That's what a lot of them would say. I would say, don't. Like that risk is completely unnecessary. And finding good people, they're out there. You might have to look a little farther. And if your friends or family have really good skills, they probably also know people who also have those good skills, where the risk doesn't have to be so high. That's a really tall order to manage that type of emotional component on top of trying to build a company. Like I would never do that again.
So that kind of leads to culture. How do you feel about culture, its place, how it ties into your mission, vision, all of that good stuff? What role does it play, and when do you think it starts or should be introduced? Or
yeah. So culture is a weird one because culture exists naturally in the ideation phase because you're so centric, right? Especially if you're building on a concept. The collisions in culture don't have to be negative, right? Like somebody can feel very differently about a topic, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong. Sometimes it's how you work together that's more important than the things you believe, right? Unless it's like a tenant, right? Like we're going to go do this, and they're like, fundamentally, I don't believe in doing that, right? Like that's going to be a real collision. But otherwise, I think like it tends to almost make you stronger. I tend to not agree with a lot of people, and early days, we took the doors off of our office to showcase, hey, listen, we're really open to this open environment. And I remember my people being like, put that door back on. You guys scream and we can't get anything done. But it really opened up a cool opportunity to expand on culture. As you get later into your company, people are farther away from that impact point. I'm sure work from home exacerbated this for a lot of startups too, but naturally, the water cooler effect disappears. So a lot of the natural culture and the feelings that build up around that kind of disappear. And a lot of people they reconcile the past. They'll say, remember how great it was when, like that type of thing. And so to bring culture into the future as you're a scaling company, I think what you have to do is you have to make it a stakeholder. I think that's actually the secret to growing a culture again. So and I don't mean it disappears. It's just like business can kind of take the front driving seat at times, right? Culture is something that's kind of following it along. You have to make it a first-class citizen in your business. And that's because in a scaling business, that culture you had, which will evolve to some degree, is going to carry a lot of tenants, and somebody needs to carry those on their shoulders and push those into the future. And people like to point at the founder and say, that's the founder's job. The reality is like, no, it's not. Like the founder's job at that point is probably 1,000 other things that are more important, like vision and like direction and like, as I describe it, slowly reading the newspaper every day, putting out fires left, right, and center when they happen. But making those tenets that made you what you were and help you evolve into the future, that really is all about bringing someone in to understand how your people are solving problems. Like for us, we use it very anecdotally. There's like common sayings, and those sayings have underlying theses. Thesis is, you know, the underlying values underneath them that are tied back, right? Like we ingenuity as a company, a very important topic of finding answers in creative ways. And in reality, it shows up in a lot of our company when things went poorly, when like chaos was going on. And so we like leaned into this concept of like embrace chaos. That's kind of like one of the things like, don't worry about it. Chaos is normal. But really what you're saying is like, be resilient, like go find these. So you need somebody to carry that on their shoulders so that it doesn't get conflated with like, we're just unorganized. And so that I think is more about bringing culture into making it a first-class citizen, because as you scale your business, you're scaling people. People are farther away from that core team. And that core team has a lot of feelings and a lot of opinions, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But as you build a business, you also have to, you know, build a business. So naturally, there's a distancing effect. And by the way, the worst people to carry culture are your early people. They're the worst because they have very rigid views, right? And a scaling business doesn't look like your early stage business. So culture is a very, very important concept. Who carries that torch is probably the most important piece. And I think it's really important to bring in people to carry those torches and reflect back into the company to understand what it is inside the company that makes you unique. It may not match up anymore with the things you thought it was. And that's not a negative. That's just like the nature of a company's culture. It's evolving, changing.
So I'm going to open it up to anyone who has a question that would like to ask Jory directly. Feel free to either put it in the chat or just unmute and ask him directly. And everybody gets shy.
Well, while we wait for one, I actually have an entertaining dealing with the current status of the world tidbit. So right in real time, the IRA bill is passing its way and making its way into law. And in my ecosystem, this is like game changing. Like no one saw this coming. But the reality is that it's dragging, kicking and screaming a lot of the old world into the new world, because there's a lot of heaviness to the way the bill is implemented, especially when it came to like the energy sector in our space. What's interesting is that the things that we were strongest in just believing were right, and so we as a team built because we thought it was right, are more impactful now than the things we were doing because customers said we need this. And what we were realizing and are always realizing is that one of the most important things in building a company is to build what they need, not what they want. And so a lot of what we've been building for years and continue to build has this thesis of like building to the world and building to the concept, this vision that is aligned with what you believe. And that doesn't mean you don't build for your customer. Of course you build for your customer, but it means you don't just do and lean into the things they want. And oftentimes that's just because companies don't know what they want. They think they know what they want.
And the difference between push and pull, who creates the dynamics, certainly a lot to play there.
Yeah, certainly I don't think anyone saw Manchin flipping like he did. So I think a lot of people had written that off. What's funny though is that our largest customers that work in oil and gas, like these majors, we took money from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative to specialize and focus our time into this ESG space because we think the E is the important one. The funny part is they didn't really care what was going on. They were planning on building for this future anyways. They just didn't know how. And I think that a lot of the regulation we're seeing right now is telling them how. And so it was nice because we were building what we believed they needed, not what they said they wanted. And so those kind of have a funny way of finding their way through. And I suspect that if the administration were to change, what we would probably find is that we would continue to build what we think they need, which might be carving into a more descriptive way of implementing these regulations. But nonetheless, it's what they need.
So what do you see going forward for Andium?
Well, I think the most interesting space and set of customer needs that technology has the ability to empower goes back to the original thesis, which is probably the one that I'm glad I stuck with. It naturally kind of came through, which is you're kind of just building asset level information because people have to change their world. And the information that people tend to rely on is asset level, or they need, right? Whether they want it or not. When I worked in transit systems, the answer was always, remember the traffic lights to enter the highway? Like they'd have those signs and everyone would queue up. And after a while, people just wouldn't follow it and they wouldn't wait. The reality is that was just like an intersection for the highway. Those systems were actually extremely effective. They just weren't fair. So, because if you were going 3 exits, it was almost irrelevant. And go onto the highway, you'd try to use like side streets. So I think the asset level information is still the most empowering information if you're trying to empower leadership, because that's the information that they're all lacking.
So we've had a couple of folks drop off because of the time of day. If you could give 1 to 3 lessons that would be like earth shattering if somebody kept them in mind, like, that I'm going to remember that, that's really going to be helpful in their business, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I would say the first one is competitors in an early stage company are your best friend. And that's counterintuitive. As like lesson number 1, everyone wants to talk about why they're different, which is great. And you should. It's important to be different. The reality is that most very valuable and disruptive technologies, if you're really the only one, there's going to be a lot of challenges. We ran into this in our own sectors. Like if you're the only one there, like the education, the convincing people, all of it, even if it's valuable, is much harder. So don't worry about competitors so much. Just build your thing. Like those competitors might even help you from the standpoint of fundraising or even partnering. In our segment now, we do a lot of methane because it's such a terrible, unnecessary gas that is released into the atmosphere. It's responsible for 1/3 of global warming, and 70% of it is preventable. About half of that profitably. The most interesting piece in that, though, is that there's all of these players trying to solve this problem, and people want to highlight them as competitors. And we're realizing that we're either all going to win or we're all going to fail. And so the competitors end up being some of our best potential partners and best potential collaborators, even when we're dealing with things like responses to EPA regulations, because you're either winning or losing together. So that'd be like number 1. I'd probably start there. Like, I don't know how many lessons someone needs. That one's a big one. Maybe the second one would be that there's no right answers. So if you think you have the right answer, you're probably wrong, and you'll probably pivot a bunch of times. So it's more important that you believe in what you're doing and that you just keep at it. And the opportunities keep showing up, right? That luck is that perspiration meets opportunity. And then I think the third one would be, I think I may have said this already, but if you wait until you think your product is ready for market or your thing is ready for market, you waited too long. Because the likelihood you're going to have to pivot it is so high that doing that is just always going to, it's not always, it's mainly going to backfire. The odds are going to be very, very much against you. And you already have everything in back into that one to say, like, it's all about execution. Can you bring that thing good enough, get it over the line with your customer and continue to execute on it? And so that execution is that like third one.
So we have another question. How did you personally deal with failure along the way, and how did you manage it and deal with it? Any insights that you could
That's
help
tough.
alleviate the pain for someone else? Or is it an important part that
Yeah,
you have to go through?
No, the reason I'm thinking a lot of it, like thinking about failure is so heavy. It's the nature of something you try to ignore thinking about it. I don't think that there's a failure that I think a lot of the early stage failures come down to grit. That in personal experience, if you're focusing on why you failed, you're probably helping yourself into the next phase, but you just have to get back on that horse. And I think a lot of people, those failures can be so heavy because they're very, very heavy. To me, I like to normalize failures. My same thing with the room temperature vodka shot, but just normalization on failure is part of the game. And then you have to just get comfortable being uncomfortable. Personally, I think one of the craziest failures that we went through is the second time we ran out of money. Because the second time we ran out of the money, you had double the amount of pressure. And the pressure was that you not only had employees and that you were running out of capital, but what do you tell people, right? Do you give them the level of visibility to know how bad things are? Is that just going to cause them to jump? Is the argument that just the best ones stay and that's okay? So one of the hardest things in failure that to deal with is where the line is between sharing that failure and persevering through it, and that determination to work out the other side. And how do you go about doing that in a way that doesn't part too far from what you're comfortable with, meaning both morally and ethically and so on. For example, I can tell you on a government level, you have to furlough your employees before you run out of money because you have to be able to pay them for the next paycheck. I don't think any founder who doesn't have an HR person or a PEO system would know that, right? Like you just go too far because you don't know any better. You're just like, yeah, I guess we're out of money. That's how it goes. So there's these lines. And so I think that was probably the hardest emotionally. And I think the way we reasoned through it was we decided to share and employ the same decision-making on both those good times and how we make decisions consistently. And so by holding that line and being true to it, those failures ended up being a strength. And I'll give you an example. When the pandemic hit, I think a lot of people cut salaries. I think that was normal. I watched my brother's company do it at huge, large scale, and you almost got a freebie. Even if you didn't need to cut, people would cut jobs because it saves the company money. And we just fundamentally disagreed with that. So we didn't touch salaries at all, even if it was hard on the company and on valuation and on all these other things. We just didn't touch it. We didn't even frame it for a certain period of time. We just said, listen, we're going to find a way to turtle through this thing, work out the other side. And I think the loyalty that we got from that didn't show up the standpoint of who stayed and who left. I think people are always going to make those decisions on a personal level. I think where it manifested was some of our best ingenuity came out of that time period. And I don't think they're directly connected. I don't think it was because we didn't cut their salary. I think it was the universe paying it forward and being yeah, all these opportunities, all this great innovation just somehow showed up. And so I can't say they're connected, but what I can say is that it definitely validated a lot of those hard decisions and those shitty moments, because all of a sudden you feel like there's some justice in the world, which there isn't always. So yeah,
and some might argue that necessity is the mother of invention, that because you put yourself in such a difficult spot, it forced you to be more creative, more innovative, more willing to take the risks to overcome.
Could be. Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that. I'm very good at failing. So I guess after a while, the normalization helps you through it. There's no question about that. Good support system is key, but it's hard because you're dumping, especially early stage, you're dumping something that is much more core to self than just work. It's not like when you come home with your significant other and you spend 15 minutes talking about your day, right? It's a totally different game because you're living it. One of the best decisions I ever made as a founder, I was obviously working at home because, office was such a waste of money at the time. Now I couldn't disagree more, but at the time it was such a big deal. I actually picked up hobbies. I started cooking a lot because it guaranteed that at the end of the day, I was doing something that pulled me out enough that I could like separate work from non-work time. But brain's kind of still on. And so I think one of the things in failure you realize is dumping on people that you love when shit is bad is really hard, and it can cause you to go into like a pretty strong depression. And so one of the ways you carry through is normalization of that process and repeatable pattern and habits. Those are really, really good things. The other, I think, is that you naturally in the early days, you build up people that are like-minded. And so you tend to run in and go through that journey with others that believe the same things you believe, but also want to push towards that outcome that you both agree with, right? Because it's not somebody who disagrees with you. You said people that in the company would just disagree for the sake of disagreeing, and that is like the worst of the worst. Like just arguing for no good reason. But yeah, I'd say the feeling of failure and the dealing with the depression and all the things you go through as a founder comes from like having a solid network of people on the work side and having people in the community side. I would very much discourage putting too much of that onto family, whether you work with them or whether it's just someone you come home to. That can start to make it impossible to get past that depressive thing, because it starts to impact relationships and then kind of trickles through. So yeah, community, repeatability, those things.
So as a follow-up to that, would you recommend that especially founders in the early stages get a mentor or an informal board of advisors? Or
That's a good question. I think sounding boards in general is good. I don't think coaching is ever a negative. I think every venture would tell you coaching is like the key, but I think maybe they're just trying to frame out a conversation associated with founders not thinking they have all the answers. I think mentorship is.
you just lost your sound.
Oh, sorry about that. You got me back? All right.
Yep, you're back.
I think mentorship rounds out your weaknesses in times when you're focusing on your strengths, because mentorship tends to bring about the items that as somebody who's in the depths of it, you tend to look at the same set of resources that have the same answers, and no one tends to think about the founder themselves. Accelerators are really good at helping companies, especially small, young companies, understand the processes, building process, thinking about product and customer. It's horrendously bad, as is venture, at focusing on founder-related challenges, like dealing with co-founder components. How do you deal with equity? Like all those types of things. Like that's like a lost art. Sometimes I think the reason that like Andreessen Horowitz is so successful is that both those guys were founders. And so all the other companies they invested in were like people that looked and acted like them, where they were like their own mentorship network for that community, which is why when they were small, they were so successful at picking winners relative to, now, and they're a little bit more standard. And depending on how you feel about Web3, maybe not great, but the, the mentorship component to it is very, very valuable for that reason, because it brings about resources and knowledge and thought leadership in areas that you tend to not find it, even in that ecosystem that you're in. So that part I would agree with. And coaching is always valuable because you just don't know what you don't know. I think those like naturally are benefits. The question that I would say is like, is it a really good use of time? Coaching, not as much in my opinion in the early stage as mentorship. In the later stage, coaching becomes more important than the mentorship.
So here's the last call. We have just a few minutes left. Anybody want to have the last question? Well, it seems that you've covered so much, Jory. Thank you. So we have one last question. How do you normalize failures? Can you hear me, Jory? Can anyone hear me? Okay, so it's not me who's frozen.
Nope. I think I'm back. I don't know what
Okay.
happened because my ping rate was pretty good.
So we do
Zoom just died.
we do have one last question. How do you normalize failures?
Yeah, pattern, and more pattern. You build pattern. The thing is, like, for a company, process is the key to growing, right? Like process, you build a person, they build a process, you manage that process. It makes things scalable in a way, right? But it's also like the death of innovation. like it's the antithesis of innovation in a way. You have to break process in order to create innovation space, right? Whether it's regulation based, whether it's like corporate based. When it comes to working through building as an individual, that process is more about having repeatable patterns because you need to normalize yourself, right? You have to have that constant baseline that you're referring back to. In fact, in a nerdy note, artificial intelligence engines are best when you continuously re-normalize the data. And they're designed to build like human brains. And so there's this common pattern that we're seeing that's like, you have to keep training, you have to keep normalizing, you have to keep coming back to this baseline because it's really important from the standpoint of working through failure to understand what works, what doesn't, and all of that.
Excellent. So I would like to thank you, Jory, very much for taking the time to share your insights with us and to thank everyone for hanging in there with us till the end. If you have any additional questions, please just put them in our Slack and I will forward them to Jory for his feedback. We have recorded, it'll take us a little while to get it up, but we will reach out to everybody so you'll have the opportunity to review any material. So Jory, again, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining with us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.